Great, we'll give this a whirl then. So I am going to share information on this. Go through. Close some of my things so you don't have to see everything. And all right, can you see it? It looks like you can. All right, so kind of our agenda today, we're going to kind of review some of those elementary other configurations that we talked about. I have an example of a kind of a multi-age scenario that one of our team members here shared, and I'm just going to kind of lay that out so you can see what that looks like. It's a variation of a multi-age, but it's more changing buildings. And then some additional multi-age considerations. There is one that Dr. Lewis has asked us to share with principals and get some principal feedback and some information back. So I want to make sure that we walk through what that looks like so that if you all have questions or are looking for something as feedback from principals, or that we can kind of keep an ear out for, that we'll come back and reevaluate, but just wanted to keep you in the loop on what that might look like. And then just a hypothetical, because the conversation of if you do repurpose or close, are there savings? How does that look? So we'll kind of walk through that. And then we'll spend a bulk of time on virtual education, the virtual school, and costs and things around that, because it does play a big part in where we might have revenues generated, but not necessarily all have to be used at the virtual school, that can help our general fund. And in addition, if the state directs us to not have remote learning next year, that the only option is the virtual school, that also plays a factor in what could or couldn't happen to our enrollment and what we might need to think about. And then if we do have time, there is a few other of those additional expenditure areas to just kind of lay out on the table for conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of get started, and please don't hesitate to ask questions. I think the discussion is good around these, because it helps us understand, one, what we're looking at, and two, what we might be missing, or is there data we need to collect that helps support things that are being talked about, so that we can make good decisions based on all factors. So the second slide is just a reminder of the calendar dates that we've set out there. I think the next one is actually at 3:30 time, and then everything after that is the 4 o'clock to 5:30 time. So just wanted to make sure you had that reminder out there. So the next slide I'm going to talk through is really one that you've already seen, and just a reminder of, if we don't do anything with our elementary, we recognize this 3.0 FTE because our enrollment, and even with projections for next year, goes down. And so the staffing at the existing levels, which is the 25, 27, and 30, it actually has other levels. They're over here: the 25, 27, 30, the 26, 28, and 31, and then the 24, 26, and 29. So we have those different levels based on the buildings. And you can see that if we were to apply that, we would have sections of 216. Our target for budget this year has been 219. So that's actually a savings of 3, and that would generate that 194,004 as a savings by doing nothing more than just applying what is the current ratios, the current information. So one of the questions that kind of navigates into the multi-age, before I kind of get to just multi-age by similar to what we've talked about in the past, was it's a form of multi-aging, but looking at what if one school became a primary and one school became not a secondary, but an intermediate. I think my slide says secondary. And what would that look like? Because you're kind of blending a couple of schools together, but you're focusing one building to be primary and one building to be intermediate grades. And the scenario that was shared, that I'm going to share with you, is looking at New York and Kennedy maybe being the primary, because that's where early childhood is, and then the secondary or the intermediate being potentially New York. You have other schools that are close together. You could think about those as being other scenarios. Obviously, transportation gets involved, walking distance from school, some of those kinds of things. But it is a way that you can look at repurposing or maybe creating efficiencies in your buildings, depending upon where those boundaries are and what that might look like. And so the next slide is really just walking through what that scenario might be. So you can kind of just get a flavor for it. So Kennedy, the way it looks, is sitting at the top. New York is the second one. And based on the way they look as they stand, Kennedy is 11 teachers and New York is 12 teachers. And that's applying the ratio through there. So let's look at just primary, add those together for the two buildings and create just a primary building. And what you'll see is 31 plus 33 is 64 kids. And if you apply the section ratio thresholds back, you get 3 sections of kindergarten. Individually, there's 4 sections of kindergarten, but by blending them into one building, you have a little bit higher class sizes and you have one section fewer at kindergarten. You have the same thing that occurs at first grade, 15 and 14, 14 and 15, the 29, you get 58 kids when you divide it back out. You only need 3 sections to stay within your threshold versus that 4 if the buildings are separate. And the same scenario actually occurs at second grade. Does that make sense? Do you kind of see how that's working? So when you go across, if you were to look at them individually, you would need 6 sections or teachers at Kennedy and 6 at New York in order to do those primary grades as separate buildings. When you blend them, you need a total of 9, which is 3 less. And thus there's a reduction of sections or staffing at that primary section. So then you would shift and do the same thing in the intermediate grades. 31 plus 42 is 73. You spread that with the sections. I got somebody waiting in the lobby that called in. I'm not sure how to do that. Zach, how do I call in, or do I need to unshare to get them from my lobby into the space?
So you need to admit them.
Can I do that without signing off or sharing?
Yes, so at the top of your screen, you should have that red bar.
Yeah.
And if you pull down on that, click the down, it should give you some options.
Not to let somebody in.
Kathy, if you click on the participants, does it show that there's somebody there you can admit in from that bar up top?
Let me look. Oh, there. Thank you. I've not had to do that. Okay. All right. And so when you do that with the intermediate grades, you see the same kind of thing. Kennedy, New York by itself, it's 6 sections. Kennedy by itself, it's 5 sections. When you blend them, you only need 9 sections, which is a reduction of 2. So overall, this scenario as a form of redistributing kids or repurposing ends up with actually 5 sections fewer or 5 staff fewer, which is a savings of the 323, 340. So it's a form of multi-aging across buildings a little bit, more of isolating one building to primary and one to secondary. Other things to consider, transportation costs, families having students at 2 schools. What's your reaction to a scenario like this when you think of Lawrence? I know it's been discussed before in Lawrence over the years, but I don't really know how viable it is, but it is an option and there is savings behind it. So I open it up for thoughts, questions, other things that would have to be considered.
So, Kathy, this is Myron. I was in a community in my career where our elementary school went to save some money. They went to grade level attendance centers, like what attendance center was. First grade, second grade, they actually did that. And that was a way to save money. And once the parents got over the shock of it a little bit, of the transportation and some of the having students at different schools, it did work well. It was a cost-saving method, other than just closing down schools completely and transporting kids. So.
Okay. Well, I appreciate hearing that feedback. That any other thoughts or questions around that or reactions? A lot of our elementary schools are really close together, and although some of our folks think their neighborhood school is one building, they almost live closer to one of the other ones in reality. So it's something to consider, something to think about as we navigate this. So as we think about the multi-age, unless there's other questions, comments, do you see this as an option in this community at all before I move on to looking at the scenario that is going to kind of be pushed out to have some feedback from elementary principals?
Kathy, this is Catherine Glidewell. Has the boundary
Yes.
committee seen this at all to see what their thoughts are on it as well, or will this be presented to them?
We can definitely share it. This was something that was brought by one of our own committee members here, and if they want to chime in, they certainly can. As an option to think about, outside the box, you can certainly look at that. Look at those overall boundaries. We have a tool that we can do that and see if that's an option. How quickly something could be done, is obviously a question. But I could certainly pass that along to see if that's a scenario.
This is Jill Anderson, and the other thing to look at is these numbers aren't even any multi-age classroom scenario, which would kind of level out some, even class sizes, even more. Not that you would need more teachers, but it would kind of even out some. If just one of them would be multi-age, some of those class sizes. So, and even if you did that, if we didn't do all 5, but we only did 4, that's still cost savings if we did that. So I think it's an option. We don't want to just say, oh no, we can't go there. I think it's something we need to think about.
Yeah. And like I mentioned, there are other schools that are fairly close proximity that have those class sizes. When you blend together, you create those savings like that. That can definitely be on our list to maybe explore further, and I can see if the boundary committee can help us with that and visit with Dr. Lewis and Anna further on that. I don't know that either one are on the call today. So the next one that I'm going to share is the one that Dr. Lewis has kind of asked that we bring in elementary principals and have further conversation to really see how doable it might or might not be, and to really kind of have that conversation about multi-age in buildings. And so this is approaching it, applying those sections or staff a little bit differently. And so I'll kind of walk through it, and then there will be a spreadsheet that we can kind of look at conceptually what it could mean in a building, and see what questions, thoughts arise as we talk through this one. So, all right. So what you're looking at on this one is, instead of applying the section by kindergarten, first, and second specifically, it's doing 2 things. It is, first of all, changing all the ratios to one below, or all the thresholds to one below the lowest one that we currently have. So the lowest one we currently have is 24, 26, and 29. And those are the schools that are in yellow. That's currently the lowest ratio. This is making all buildings these three ratios, 23, 25, and 28. So it has it hopefully swings some of the big buildings into a class size of not a threshold of 31. And yet maybe, even some things out. So what does that look like when we apply it across all buildings, but with a change in that as well, in that instead of looking at kindergarten by themselves, first grade by themselves, or second grade by themselves, we're going to pick up all the students in kindergarten, first and second, apply the ratio, you get a calculation, and then instead of having pieces and parts of a person, we round it up. We do not round it down. Always round it up. So let's look at Broken Arrow, for example. If we took all of the kindergarten through second grade students, there's 113. The ratio is 23, so it's 4.91. That calculates to 5. And then if we were doing it the current way, we would have 6. That's what our projections show. So that's actually a savings of 1 in that scenario. And then third grade calculates out the same number of staff, and 4th through 5th calculate to the same. So there's overall across the building, there's a savings of 1. And so each building, we're kind of looking at it like that. If you do that, there is a total of 14 less required to staff across all those buildings. That's a savings of this 905.
I'm on the meeting.
Hey, Kathy, there's some background noise. It's kind of hard to hear you. I think there's someone who's not muted.
Okay. Can I tell who that is?
I got it. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So when you go across all buildings and you look, you'll see a few buildings get an ad. Those are the ones in the green, and those are the ones that had those really high thresholds. So they actually gain a staff person in order to make their building work, but yet others might have a decrease based on how this makes their building work. What it does also do is what you kind of described, Jill. It really kind of pushes so that all the class sizes are very similar across all buildings, instead of some of the big swings we currently see of, maybe 13 and 14 versus 31 kind of thing. So it does kind of force that. Some thoughts before we kind of go to the workbook to see what some of that, the impact might be with it would be, some of the buildings do have Title I funds. So because all of these ratios now become the same, they aren't different, there's not a difference between buildings, then they can actually kind of relook at some of those Title I's different. We're not having to worry so much about some of the supplanting. And so if a building that is a title building chooses to use Title I funds to not multi-age, or to do something that this ratio would make a change for, that is something they could consider. The other thing that we can consider, at least temporarily, would be that the Federal CARES Act money allows us to provide intervention supports based on data and building needs that are resulting from the pandemic. So we can't actually just say, oh, we cut a teacher, we need to add a teacher. That we cannot do out of those federal funds. But what we could do once, and the principals would need to help, we would need to get data from, Zach and the folks to let us know where those needs are in those buildings, in all buildings. And if there is a need for support with a certain grade level or a certain group of kids, can that intervention be done, targeted in person, in the classroom, or how best it's delivered, and use some of the federal dollars to help target those supports where they are needed best within that building. So although there is some loss of supports with classroom teacher, maybe there's layered onto it additional supports that are actually very targeted to the students' needs based on results in the pandemic. An example might be we might have kindergartners that didn't show up this year, but they come right into first grade because kindergarten's not required. So now you've got first graders that are behind other first graders as a result of not coming to school or not getting anything out of kindergarten this year. How can we best support that? And that's a result of the pandemic. So there may be ways that we can have those conversations on top of this. And so we don't want to forget that. There's going to be also all kinds of other things we need to think about, but I'm just kind of laying some groundwork. So if we were to look at the actual workbook that I have in your folder, and see if I can pull it up. This is really the same chart, and I'm just going to work with broken arrow again. And there's no magic way to decide how you want to multi-age or to blend or what's the best way to do it. So my example is strictly to get to the right number. That's all I've tried to do here. That's why it's so important that the buildings look at this and to think about what that means in their building based on the staff that they have, based on the students that they have, based on what the data tells them might be the best way to either blend learning or whatever. So again, I looked at my broken arrow example, which is the one savings. I'm going to go to the tab of broken arrow so you can kind of see what, hopefully follow what this says. Let's see if I can make it a little bit bigger. So the first line in all of the tabs is the current staffing of a building. And that's going to make it way too big. So let me back in. So the first is just the building and the sections calculated as they normally would be calculated. And that would indicate that for the current year, they should only have 12 sections. They have 13. So we actually have more staff at Broken Arrow than what their enrollment would reflect this year. And if you remember from the previous presentations that we've done, that we have a lot of that as a result of the pandemic and as a result of distance learning and things, we have actually 9 teachers over what would be our planned teachers or staff members for this year at the elementary level. If we look at projections, you'll see that it's still doing the same way we've always done. It would still come to 12. So they're going to decrease from the current year by 1 regardless, just because we're getting them back into sync with the ratio. If we look at what this would mean based on applying, and I'm going to go back to this, based on applying, you see that the primary grades is where the 1 is coming from. I suppose a principal could choose to do this differently as long as they ended up with just the 11. But what I have, or how they have to look at it, is we have 35 kindergartners. So I need to come up with 35, the 23 and the 12 equal 35. I can't have a classroom more than 23, ideally, based on these ratios. So 12 become this kind of blended with 10 of first graders for a group of 22, a group of 23. My first graders total 43. It's these 10, that 23, and 10 in this multi-age was second grade. Does that kind of make sense? And so then you have multi-age. Some of the second graders came and did this multi-age 23, and I end up with my 5 teachers here. And then 2 doesn't change, 2 doesn't change, and I end up with my 1 less when I'm all said and done. It's really the principal that needs to have some input on this to determine if that makes sense for their particular building. But the goal would be, could they make their building work with 1 less based on how this lower class size ratio, would impact things. Because third grade is kind of unique in that we just have third grade with its own ratio, in a lot of cases, those class sizes still kind of say small. So it could be that a principal may want to navigate those kids as something into second or fourth. And I think that would be up to the building. For example, on Deerfield, when you look at how it calculates, when it's 3.16 and we round to 4, that tells you those class sizes are going to be below what the threshold is, because it's just barely over 3, but because we're going to always round up, it goes to 4. Whereas Broken Arrow, they're going to be pretty close to that ratio of 25 because I'm at 1.96. So I'm rounding up, and there's not a lot of round there. That tells me that they're probably pretty close to threshold in that particular grade level. Does that kind of make sense in understanding that? So let's look at, we can look at all of the buildings, but I kind of wanted to jump down to Langston because Langston shows that they get 2 additional. These thresholds are very different than what they're used to now. And when I look at it, it doesn't mean that they might not have to multi-age. But what it does do is it really brings their class sizes in line with across the district a little bit. So when you think about, they're used to 25-ish, 26 on their kindergarten, it still just has, it brings it down to 22 because I can't go over 23, and then there would be a kind of a blended, but with second grade. They gained a couple teachers, and where they gain it, instead of 31, and 30 here at 6th grade, they're not going to have any more than 28. It does have some blending at this grade. It kind of changes this to 2 classes instead of 1 at that threshold, or instead of 3. But overall, they're going to have a gain of 2 staff members throughout their building to help with kind of pulling that down. Does that kind of make sense? Every building's different. We could look at a New York, for example. They're showing as 3. They're also a Title I building. We would want to make sure to look at data to not, to make sure that if they have intervention supports needed for the pandemic, that we also help them with that. But you can see that their class sizes do get closer to that lower threshold from where they were. And that's why they're losing those sections or those FTE. Does that kind of make sense? Thoughts on some of this? This is moving forward for principal input. Dr. Lewis really wants to have buildings kind of weigh in on the concept of multi-age, the idea of what this might mean to their building. The 14 is a lot of FTE and translates to savings, but you also don't want to do that just without consideration to a lot of things. So one of the questions that I do see in the chat, and I think that is a very valid question and one that I would have as well. Right now, if you go 1 person over, that threshold, they usually look at how to provide another section or things like that. That may not be financially an option. So do we look at how we would address that? And I think those protocols would have to be laid out clearly on the front side as to whether there's para support or how that would need to be navigated. And I think that would be a discussion with the principals as to how that should or could be handled in a building, depending upon, because we're having to do this based on projected enrollment for next fall. And normally there's some changes in that anyway, but due to the pandemic, as we know, we have really, it's a guess as to what that might look like for us in the fall. And so we do need to navigate what will happen to a plan for blended if our enrollment changes, and at what point and how are additional supports provided. So I don't know if that answered your question, Mary, but I think that would have to be something that we have a system around before we even get started so that we know what the expectation is and we can plan for it budgetarily if it's going to require dollars. So instead of, the full 14 as a savings, just because it mathematically calculates, it may be going back to some of those contingency numbers that, we had some set aside contingencies. So when those kinds of things happened, we could address those in the middle of the year or as they occurred. Thoughts about this or questions? I know it's what we've talked about in the multi-age, blended learning kind of environment, even last year. But this is kind of putting it forward. I will be really anxious to hear what principals lens on this. I'm anxious to hear what teachers have to say. So if they're, I'd love to hear from any of you to see what comments or questions, thoughts, things that we need to think about that I didn't mention.
Kathy, last year when we were looking at blended learning or the multi-age, Dr. Lewis and Dr. Stubblefield talked about how they were looking at the PD and getting people into these meetings and that kind of front loading that professional development, or at least their plan. Given the pandemic and given the multiple learning methods that the brick and mortar teachers are working on now, would that even be realistically feasible to get all of that in on top of what everyone's doing to roll out by the fall?
I think that's a legitimate question, and I don't have an answer to that, and some of them are not on the call today, so I think we would definitely put it on the list that we need more information about how this would be rolled out, the kind of PD that would maybe be needed, and how to deploy that in a way that teachers feel prepared to deal with this on top of everything else that's happening. So I think that's very valid, and I think I have a note of that somewhere. If I didn't, I think it's right here on this particular slide here. It's not on my spreadsheet one, but on the actual slide itself.
Kathy, I thought that when we talked about this last year, it was about kindergarten and third grade, or kindergarten would be kind of left alone. So in your scenario, we have them bunched with first and second. And I didn't know if that was something that we decided it needed to be, or where that came about.
That was just me mathematically trying to figure out how to get the FTE to work. I think I would defer to the building and how they best. This is assigning the staff to the building, but not necessarily placing them. So I suppose a building could think about taking that same FTE that we've assigned to them, but avoiding kindergarten and then having to navigate the blended in the upper grades in a fashion. So, and I don't have every grade blending. I just like I said, mathematically, but just to get it kind of out there as a visual. Other people may have a much better visual or a way that they would want to look at that differently. And I think there's lots of ways to look at it. This is just kind of laying out there. One, there's a savings tied to it, and then what would it look like in the midst, and somewhere in between is probably where we will land, but we have to lay it out there for discussion and questions. And so that's where I'm starting. So, but I think I would, that'll be interesting to see if that's how principals feel too, as far as, where that works the best in their particular building. Other thoughts? Did this kind of make sense? Just the scenario and the like I said, third grade kind of has its own world here. We've never really looked about what it might mean to change it or blend it with a grade ahead or behind. So it's kind of, it's a hybrid of what we already do, but just, changing it a little bit. So all of those factors are things that could be reevaluated differently as well. So, if you come up with an idea or a thought or question about this, obviously this would domino with specials and sections around PE, art, music, and how that might look in a building, and all those things. So, there's other dominoes that have to be looked at, obviously, with any scenario. This is just sort of that first visual. And I believe HR, David Cunningham, I think was on here, but I believe HR has started to set those meetings up with principals in order to get some feedback so that we can have further discussion about, a version of this potentially when it's all said and done. Other thoughts or questions about this? It's kind of a continuation of what some of the conversation we had last year, just kind of another variance of it or a variation of it.
So the CARES Act, the intervention support, is that all the way through 12? Is that K through 12, early childhood through 12? Where?
It could be anything. It has to meet one of the 15 criteria that we have as a permissive use.
Okay.
And the targets really are, other than sanitation of buildings, and some of those are very specific in those criteria. The focus is really to provide that academic support, is one of the focuses, to provide that academic support or loss of academic achievement that's directly tied to the pandemic. It has to be a result of the pandemic, and that we're supporting as a result of that. So, the summer learning.
It's only 1 year. Like, is that money for one?
It doesn't, no. We have multiple years to spend it, but it doesn't come and continue to be. So it's not something that's going to carry us for the next 10 years kind of conversation. It is.
But it's not just a one school year and done kind of thing. We could have it more than that.
We have multiple years to spend it. So we would not want to spend all of it in the first year if we think that we might need this over the next couple of years. And as we look at big picture, we need to think about how that all blends together in a way that makes us move forward the way we need to. And part of that puzzle piece is the students and enrollment coming back and a variety of other things that our buildings, if the enrollment doesn't come back and our buildings continue to drop with a capacity below 50%, we need to kind of think about what that really means for that building and is it being effectively used, which kind of leads me into the next scenario that takes a little bit longer when we talk about what we might be thinking about in the future, whether it's next year or even 2 years from now. Just again, it takes time. And again, if enrollment doesn't bounce back and we really do find ourselves with buildings that are below those capacity recommendations of 85%, we have quite a few below there now, but if we are seeing some that drop even, to 40% or some of that, that's when you really need to look and see if it makes sense to reevaluate the use of a building. And so I just wanted to walk through a hypothetical with you in order to just kind of wrap your head around what that might look like, or the steps that we might need to take based on a boundary scenario that would allow us to vet that out in a fashion. And so, when you think about it, particularly in Lawrence Elementary, we have 14, but why consider repurposing or closing a building as an option? It is important fiscally. We review all possible solutions. And if we know enrollment's declining, like I said, or not bouncing back, and we know future funding is projected to be a decrease or flat, at some point, it's not an option for us to not look at reallocating existing funds or really looking at the efficiency and capacity of our buildings. What's involved in the process, there's quite a bit, and depending upon the complexity, if it's a fairly simple scenario or solution, it could be a few months. If it's something a lot more complicated, lots of dominoes, lots of whatever, it could take 12 months. And so we really need to think about that strategically, where that fits into the puzzle. And then is there really savings from that when it comes to repurposing and or closure? So wanted to just share how to kind of maybe we would walk through that. And again, the scenarios really are dependent upon what the actual selection of choice is and how that might look. So if you look at my hypothetical, you'd have to go out and you'd have to look at a boundary map, and you'd have to see if there's how best to draw lines, and then look at other schools in the vicinity that group of residents would attend. So because we have so many transfers in and out, there's a lot of needing to look at that, because we have a lot of kids attending a school that's not their residing school. And yet, if we do something with that building, would they go back to their the building where they reside, or would they go to and want to transfer to wherever the transfer proposal would be? So there's a lot more to it than just, oh, these kids go here and these kids go here, because all of our kids don't all attend schools that they're residing in, and we would be looking at this initially from residing and then attending. But let's just hypothetical. School Z is the one that we're just going to either repurpose or we're going to close, just as an example. And we're going to move, and looking at boundaries, we're going to end up with 3 different locations where kids, depending upon where they live, might end up. So school Z might end up in A. We know based on boundary lines that 80 potentially would end up in school A, 82 in school B, and 35 in school C. So school Z has 11. As a result of that, and 80 moving in, we know 12 are going to kindergarten, this many are going to first, this many to second. And so you take the new total and figure out what those sections are. We're using existing information in this hypothetical, and that's all it is. So in school A, 2 sections here, and they go to 2 sections. We added kids, but we didn't get above threshold. We just changed that size. The same with this. This one actually would move to 3 sections. So there's an add. Do you see how that kind of works? And so we would do this based on what the scenario was presented to us. And then as the finance side of it, we would evaluate what that would mean in different aspects to see if there is or is not any savings. So similar to the multi-age information or the blended learning information and staffing changes that we just talked about, or the one we talked about before that was the primary intermediate type scenario, it's the same kind of initial steps to walk through. So school B, you would see that 82 are moving in, and you'd see that kindergarten is going to need a new section, so that's an add. Second and third look to be similar. Looks like third would potentially need an add in this hypothetical. Fourth would need an add, and fifth. So overall, you would need 4 to make school B work with the kids that moved in, because the sections or that has to follow where our kids land. And then school C with the 35, you'll see that although the class sizes bump just a little bit, they're all well under the threshold, and there would be no adds necessary for that particular scenario. So we went from 11 to 5 transferring with the kids, leaving a savings of 6. Not knowing kids, not knowing transfers, maybe 2 are left for contingency. And this particular hypothetical with the staffing side of the sections would be a $258,000 savings related to those 4 that we didn't have to assign following the kids. Does that kind of make sense? So that would be the first kind of piece of it. But even before we went there, it's the boundary committee that would have to do the work to determine what makes sense for boundaries. If a school's at capacity, they have to think about where those kids would move. You can't move all your kids into a building if it puts them over capacity. So those would be hypothetical examples. This is just a hypothetical, but a lot of those kind of pieces would have to be considered. But if you did, maybe that scenario sounds like it's workable. And so are there other costs? Because obviously there are core costs with every single building. And so what might those be that would also be considered in this potential? So the savings of this hypothetical for staff that didn't move with kids is about the 258. If we move them through, there are other things that are at every building. And if you have one less building, then you would not conceptually need those particular positions. So every building has a principal. Every building has an administrative assistant. These are average costs. This is not a specific person in a specific building. These are just average costs of that particular position. Guidance, there's one at every elementary school, so we would not need that position. You would have to look at learning coaches. Some already have a 1.0, some do not. And some of the enrollment would not bump it to go from 0.5 to 1.0. So in this particular hypothetical, school B would have been big enough to already have had a learning coach of 1.0. So the 0.5 from the school that would be closed in this hypothetical would be a savings. And then nursing and health office assistants, we always try to get to a 1.0 or as close to that as possible with each building. And so that has already occurred at those buildings where students moved. So theoretically, there may not be a need for those FTEs. Again, this is just hypothetical. We would obviously have to look at all those dominoes before you could say for sure. School B would have grown enough that we would add an additional 4 hours to a second secretary. So from a half-time secretary, they would move to a full-time along with a full-time administrative assistant. So we need to add back some cost there. And then for the most part, there's a full-time librarian, and you end up with a savings on those other positions in this particular example only of kind of that core of the 342. So total in this hypothetical, before you look at dominoes, before you look at other things that need to potentially be considered, kind of core overhead is about a $600,000 of savings. If you actually close the building and don't repurpose it, you can consider custodial, you can consider utilities, grounds, and upkeep. But if you keep that building open, then you have to think about what that looks like and the impact on costs. And that may not be a savings to be considered. And then other considerations in this kind of a scenario, we would have to look at transportation based on the redistribution. If it's Title I buildings are involved, you would need to look at that and how it applies to that. Do we have special education programs, students in special programs, ESL? Do we have specials? Again, the sections that we just talked about, training, changing, does that impact our specials, art, music, and PE? So this is it takes a little longer to do. It takes more time to really think about all those dominoes. And yet, as we think about where we are with buildings, where we are with enrollment and future, knowing the next 2 to 3 years may not look any better than it does this year, and enrollment may or may not bounce back. And so as we look at buildings that are really not being used to their fullest capacity, does this make sense? And so I think those are questions that we'll need to look at. I know Boundary Committee is looking at buildings with capacity, those under capacity. If there's options that would make sense to reevaluate. And then I think once they came up with those kinds of scenarios, it would fall on us to work through this kind of a scenario to navigate what would make sense to be able to say there's some realized savings from that particular, or costs that we need to think about in that particular scenario. So thoughts about this? Does this make sense? Are you surprised by kind of where this ends up? Did you think it'd be more? Did you? I'm just kind of, I think trying to give you an overview of steps we would take based on a scenario that we might need to work through, and how this compared to some of the blended learning we just talked about, or scenarios, or a combination of all of the above, maybe where we end up over the next couple of years. But I want to, and where we can go next year, short term versus long term. This is going to end up being kind of a strategic, multi-phased process for us, I think. Thoughts, comments, questions? Anna, are there anything going on in the boundary committee that would lend to future considerations that we do or don't know about yet?
Boundary Committee has only met once. We
Okay.
meet again next Thursday. I actually was about to invite you to share this scenario because we haven't had a clear charge. So nothing has come from Boundary. We met each other. We looked at, they received the report that Rob did, and then our next meeting is next Thursday where we will start to talk about, looking at that information and what impact or what direction needs to go, because we don't have a change the boundaries for this or that type of thing. So I was actually going to invite you, Kathy, to share this scenario to help them to know like what are possible, what one hypothetical situation can look like. So.
And you weren't here when we went through the kind of scenario example before we went through the blended learning, but we did go through another kind of hypothetical or consideration of a primary intermediate combination with New York and Kennedy. And I think there was some, and I can't tell from here who might have made the comment that wondered if that was something the boundary committee would at least run as a scenario so that to see of the feasibility and if there are any other buildings that might be an option too. I know there's a lot of dominoes, but that was asked before you got on the line. And so I don't know if you have a comment about that or if we want to just run a hypothetical scenario on that as well.
We can. I think any of those types of things to share with the boundary committee will then allow them to know and understand. And then once they have a clear charge, then they can start to, look deeper at those scenarios in order to make a recommendation.
Okay, thank you. So any thoughts? Yeah. Yes.
I know, I think it was last time you shared the ELL numbers of children that were transferred out of their residential school to one of the ELL schools. And I need to go back and look that up. But that needs to be kind of looked at too, if we considered that if boundaries changed, that we could consider ELL being more in other neighborhood schools so that kids could be moved, the boundaries could be changed a little bit, not just assuming that they would all stay where they were. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think if you do look at that, there are particularly our cluster sites, some of those kids, there's more kids transferring in than actually reside anywhere close to that particular school. And so I think anything can be considered. We just have to evaluate what makes sense, and maybe it's like I said, a phasing kind of scenario. So there's a lot of transfers throughout this district to buildings that are not their residing district building. So.
I have a question. It may have been addressed. It may be beyond my depth, but I still think about it, so I'm going to pose it. If everything's distributed to kind of like the scenarios that you spoke of, would title buildings still have their own title money with regards to spend for, I guess we're trying to even the students out, and that makes sense to me. But I'm just wondering the title piece and if that's affected or not. And I apologize if I was getting my vaccination at the first 10 minutes of the meeting. So I apologize. I was the one making noise. Sorry, on my phone. I didn't mean to be unmuted.
You're fine. that was one of the comments on that scenario where we were looking at the 14 FTE decrease and how that impacts across all the buildings, and then the workbook. And my notes at the bottom do refer to Title I. And the reason that they do is that because we've changed all those ratios kind of back and everybody would be on the same playing field, schools that are Title I schools can really relook at their use of their Title I funds, and they can help support their building through their school-wide a little bit differently than maybe they've done that in the past. And so I think that's a conversation that HR and others would have with building principals as far as their use of those funds and how to best support their building, and to kind of layer on top of what these scenarios might do to their building, and where their student needs are. So really, again, relying on data and the students in their buildings and where they are and what those supports really need to be for that building. And absolutely, they can use their Title I's as part of a school-wide to help with them. So this would not take any of that away. By leaving everybody in the buildings that they currently exist, it doesn't change the makeup of the building, and so they would look fairly similar. Title I. If you start moving kids, then we look at Title I and SCS and where that all moved, and that could change how Title I is applied to a specific building. But again, that would be a domino we would want to consider if we were to do a scenario that actually moved kids out of the existing buildings the way they stand. Does that help? Okay, cool.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yep. Okay, so I wanted to spend some time or start the conversation because this was one of our kind of big pockets of money. And I think it's always one that's like, how does virtual work? What does that mean? What kind of dollars are there? How does that help the district? And I think it becomes really important going into next year and probably beyond, because if the state ultimately decides that remote learning is not going to really be an option next year unless they're in a virtual school, and because we have a virtual school, how does that navigate with the rest of our planning and dollars, and how does that look? And so virtual school has provided some information. It's fairly general. It is in your Google Drive, kind of what was submitted, but it is pretty general. There's not a lot of details there. So I'm going to try to walk through some of the details that I can today. We may not get through all of it. We can pick it up next time. I do have a slide of questions I came up with as I just was navigating through here that I wanted to follow up with. They may be your questions as we go through. They may not, but they're on slide 18. So it's kind of at the end of the section. So as I walked through here, and some of the information I'm sharing are just things that I was like, oh, what about this? And I'm kind of interested in delving in. And so I think based on what I have collected, what they've shared, and I say they, the director and coordinator over there, we may want to invite them in to have some further conversation with questions and answers, as well as we may have questions that nobody thought about that we want to find out more. So I'm going to kind of start walking through this, and hopefully it answers some questions about just the virtual school in general. So the first slide I was interested in because I kept hearing, did it grow? Where did it grow? How many kids are Lawrence kids? How many kids are kids from other districts? And what is that composition? So I was just decided I was going to put it together. And so what I have here, a couple of things. Virtual education is not just our virtual school. And for the most part, it is our virtual school, but we do have some virtual, and particularly in 2021, you'll see this non-graded. Some of our diploma completion kids have been virtual, and they aren't in the virtual school. They're part of the diploma completion program. And this year they all went virtual. So it kind of, they're in it, but yet they're not what we're going to kind of talk about for the most part, but they are in the count. So that's why you see them there. So one of the questions has been, the enrollment changed, but what does that look like? So you can see by grade, the 2021 year and the 1920 year, and the basic growth of the virtual. And again, this is a moment in time, it moves, you know, that September 21, but before then and after then, the numbers move. But you can see for the most part, the grades, primary grades, there's pretty good increase there. The secondary grades I thought was interesting, but there's kind of a decrease there, particularly at the 11th grade, which I thought was kind of interesting. What about Lawrence students? Lawrence students in 1920 were 254 of the 1,072. 393 of the 1384. So we don't make up all of the virtual school. And I have a little breakdown that I did because I was curious how many school districts are represented at the virtual school. And I'll share that here in just a second. But you can see then, which I also thought was interesting, is the Lawrence growth was, again, kind of in primary, which is what you're seeing for the overall school change. But it was down in some of these secondary. 8th grade was up, which I thought was kind of interesting. But, and maybe Brad knows something about that. I thought that was interesting. And maybe Myron knows something about why the 11th grade would have been such a decrease. But I thought that was kind of interesting that those were the two pockets of change in that regard. Any thoughts on that? Are you surprised by that?
No, Kathy, I kind of wonder, so does that include, like, we have some kids, at least I know a couple of 8th graders at West that are kind of part-time virtual school, and then they'll come in for electives or some kind of like gifted services. Does that include those kids too?
It does. It does. Yep, it does. So.
And I don't know if you look at grade 10 going to grade, because in 2019, 2020, you know, those 11th graders were 10th graders. So if you look,
right.
If you look across that way, and I don't know if it's the same students or not, but I'm sure some of them are the same students. But yeah, so.
Yeah, kind of different. It was interesting. I thought it was, you know, we've been asked the question, so there's the information. In your folder, you will also see a virtual school by district and grade. And it's 4 pages, but I highlighted anybody that was above 2% because there's so many of them. And so on the left side is 2021 and on the right side is 1920. And so, you know, you can kind of look down Blue Valley. This year we have 23 of their kids, 1.66 of the total. A year ago, we had 17 of their kids. You can see kind of that way. So I just was curious. We're 28%, 23%. Shawnee Mission, we have 87 of their kids. So obviously we're the biggest one, but there are other districts around us that we have quite a few of their kids. So that's just kind of FYI with interesting demographics of what, you can also see which grade they are attending with us. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I pulled that together for myself because I was just curious what it meant or what it was when we were asking some of those questions before. So the next slide is kind of a summary page of their dollars, what's wages and what's non-wages. And in the virtual school, you'll see that there's a lot of non-wage tied to their curriculum. And then their wage section. And these are those functions that we talked about a meeting ago or two, in which we capture information in the budget, and so we have to report by that. And so they're kind of summarized at a high level for you there. And so then you can see the spending and the total at the bottom, what was kind of unrealized versus published. And so this is kind of where we are, and this is the target for the budget based on what has been allocated to virtual. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's a lower number than maybe what their state aid is, but we talked about that needing to be realized or used as retained in the general fund in order to support shortfall. Based on where the budget sits so far, everything is falling in line with that spending level. And you can just see actual the prior 2 years budget and then what's been spent to date. Over here on the far right of this page, you can see what is their staffing FTE. So 18, 19, some of these are just name changes that didn't necessarily change, title changes, but didn't really change change what was happening at the building. So like the director assistant became the coordinator, and so there's been a director, administrative assistants, admissions specialist, your custodian, guidance. There was an ad of a mental health support staff person. There's 2 at-risk teachers. Then there's elementary, middle, high, and they do have some set aside potentially for like a yearbook or Stuco club sponsor. So that's a very high level summary of some of the information as far as what supports they have staffing wise, and then dollars that is their kind of spending. Any general questions about this before I kind of go to a next level of detail for you? Does this make sense? You can follow. Hopefully, I want to get through some of this, but I don't want to go too fast. So you have this with you. You can always mull on it, and hopefully, if I'm recording correctly, you'll be able to listen back if that's helpful. So I'm going to go to the next level because I was curious, which really wasn't laid out anywhere. And one of my questions is, do we have a set ratio for grade or elementary, middle, and high? And if we don't, if I just divide into the number of kids based on the FTE for elementary, middle, and high, what do I see? And how does that maybe look with brick and mortar? And you know, what is best practice? What should that look like? And if we're going to have a growth in the virtual school in the future, how do we plan for staff? Because we would obviously need to know how to know at what level or threshold additional staff is needed. And so my next slide is really just taking 2021 and those enrollment levels, adding them up at the end of grade 5, dividing it by the FTE that's labeled elementary, and that is the average class size per that FTE. Does that make sense? I was just interested in seeing if there was what that looked like. So middle school, it's 39. Those 8.5 FTE are working with 332 in grades 6 through 8. High school, they work with 522. There's about 15.5, so they're working with about an average. I don't know if that's actual caseload. I don't know if that's something different. I know Marcia's with us. She might have some insight as to how or why staff get assigned certain numbers of kids, if that's pretty true to what average caseload is for teachers at those levels, but that's kind of how it calculates out. Any questions or thoughts? It's really not that far different than a brick and mortar. It is a little bit higher, but it's not tremendously higher. I know I've heard people throw out 60 to 1, you know, kind of thing. I don't know that I'm not seeing that. So I don't know if there's, but I would be curious if there's a system or structure, and maybe you know as to what levels we might have added, because I know we did add quite a few elementary this year. Was there a set number that was identified in order to add an elementary staff person at the virtual? Because I know we did do that.
Kathy, the one, oh,
Go ahead, Marcia. You probably.
well, I was gonna say, the one thing to know is that at current, we don't have one grade level. So for instance, right now I'm serving both 4th and 5th grade. And so we don't do that as of now. We don't do that traditional one grade level. And then we also have teachers possibly that are assigned to the middle school who are serving certain communities or certain schools within the school. So the numbers are a little bit evened out. And then depending on, I might have, like currently I have 35 kiddos, where some kiddos lower elementary might have fewer. And then we also have what's called, right now we have team leads, and they don't serve a full caseload. They serve generally anywhere between 15 to 20. And then the rest of it's like a halftime release position is a team lead, where they go to BLT and they are a communication source to the coordinator. They do some of the mentoring of if there is new staff. So slightly different, and we've made some changes this year. And so, and I have to own this because I've said it at this meeting multiple times, that up until this year, I advocated for a higher caseload because the models was significantly different. So this year we are teaching on a regular basis our standards, regular classes, where previously I was individually conferencing on a rotating schedule, generally a half hour every other week with each kiddo or with each family. So I would have thrown out, 40 to 45 kids would have been not out of the realm of impossible. Now teaching them and grading and progress reporting and all of that good stuff, as my colleagues in the brick and mortar do, it makes it so much more impossible. But there are some little different pieces in there so it doesn't necessarily fall as neat as each grade level when it comes to staffing.
Yeah, and I kind of expected that, so I appreciate you sharing that insight and input. I think kind of understanding that structure is important, because if it grows or we have, a growth in the virtual school and we have to plan budgetarily for staffing or projections of staffing, we kind of need to understand at what level those dollars are going to need to go for that need. So I appreciate the information here, and that is one thing I'm hoping to get back from Monty in Kansas, is a little more of a structure around those assignments, and that help so that we can plan for growth and to support the needs that you all will have going forward. Because I would anticipate, if the state does change the allowance of hybrid or remote learning in particular, that virtual schools will see a change in what their enrollments will look like until the pandemic is behind us a little bit. So I want to make sure that we understand how because it could be that there are less dollars that virtual funding could have retained in general fund. They may have to support the program itself, which doesn't give us as much flexibility as we currently have, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So that's good information, and I'll get back with Anna and Candace and Monty on some more details around that, so we can kind of systematize, or at least have a structure that makes sense. So I appreciate that. So the other slide then is kind of looking at, there's probably no comparison because it's K-12, but the enrollment levels at the virtual, are creeping up to what a high school would look like. So administrative staff, and one of the comments I think you'll see in the evaluation that's in your Google Drive, and again, it's very general, but one of the questions was, do you need additional staff? Are there areas that support could be would help possibly? In general, the comment was that, they're still staffed pretty well, except for when they're having to deal with registration and enrollment. And I think that's where they really feel like they could use more people, but then other times in the year, maybe it's not as needed. And so I was curious comparatively what that might look like. So you can see what the two high schools, basically there's that 12 FTE and what it looks like. And if you were to just take the enrollment and divide it by those 12 FTE, it's about 131 student per FTE. When you look at the virtual, the 1,300 students, and then that administrative FTE, it's a little higher student per FTE. Again, I think their feedback was that in general, it seems to work, but there are those peak periods in which support is needed. So whether there's a needed support full-time or really just during those peak periods, I think is further evaluation is needed. And then I don't know the answer to this necessarily, but I had it on my list of questions is, what can we do to help if virtual does grow, and sometimes we have to cap because we can't get all those kids enrolled in time. I think that's part of what happened last year. Are we using all the tools in Power Schools? Are we using all the registration tools available to us to be able to make sure that they are getting those kids enrolled quickly, timely, and in a fashion that we can address those needs when they arise? So I don't know if there's any comments on that. I was just kind of curious what that comparison might look like. Thoughts? No? All right, I'll try to quickly get through these last few, at least on the virtual, and then the rest you can look at and we'll kind of pick up where we left off next time. Another big piece of the virtual school is staffing that's related to special education. And so that's what the next slide summarizes for you. And that is special ed staff that supports the virtual school is paid from the special education fund. The staffing information for the last 3 years looks like this. We have gifted, interrelated resource, psychologist, and a speech path. And you can see that it was 8.7, 9.3, and 9.4 this year. There's a cost associated to it. In special education, the funding is tied to a teacher, not students, and we call it categorical aid. So there's a calculation. And then the virtual school is billed for the part that is not covered by CAT aid and reimburses our special education fund for the staffing cost of special education. We can't charge it directly to the virtual fund or we'd lose out on the opportunity for the categorical aid. So we have to charge it to the special education fund, do the calculation, and then have the virtual school provide the support for the part that's not funded by categorical aid out of their virtual state aid. That's how we kind of navigate that in order to be able to get the costs covered the best that we can. And so this is what that looks like. And so that goes on top of what you saw on the previous page.
Hey, Kathy.
Mm-hmm.
I know that for the virtual school, they contract with a teletherapy company for speech language pathologist services, as well as having a couple district speech paths. So I just wondered how that fit into budget.
And I will need to look. I didn't delve that far into the details to see if it's in the special education fund's contracted services or it's in the contracted services within the virtual school fund. So I will look and see if I can track where that is specifically. It was not earmarked as virtual all by itself. So it may be bundled with another contract that is used for other buildings in the district as well.
Okay.
Kathy, do we have like numbers like for as far as SPED students per interrelated SPED teacher? Is there a?
I did not have that information, but I can certainly get that information as it ties to the assignment of the staff at the virtual school. So I will see if I can get some counts that go along with student counts that go along with this.
Is that how it's done in the brick and mortar? I'm just curious if that's how it's done in the brick and mortar when they play SPED, or is it?
Kevin's not on the call. I don't know. Anna, do you have an answer for that would help? I'm not 100% sure.
To a certain extent, it depends on the type of program, like interrelated resources versus like a autism classroom and stuff. So there are some ratios if that's how you want to put it, but it's not just like 1:15. It really depends on the needs of the students and what type of classroom it is, but there are some factors that they use, and I don't know off the top of my head.
We'll get some more information around that because we're required to provide those special needs, those IEP services for all of our kids, including virtual. I'm sure they're applying a similar rubric to the brick and mortar and virtual, but I can get more information on that, okay, before next time. So quickly, I'm going to kind of go over this next slide, which really all I'm trying to point out here is if you noticed on the summary slide, besides wages, one of our largest pieces of expenditures is tied to the 1,000 function in non-wage. And when you look at that, the big chunk is the special ed chargeback postage because they're mailing things all the time. The online resources. And so really when you think about that $1.1 million that was there and these bigger, the previous years, that's almost 90% of their non-wage budgets are on just those three things. So there's other expenditures, but the majority of the non-wage at the virtual is going to be, you know, the special education chargeback, and then it's going to be those online resources. One of the things that I did ask have on my questions in the slide is, you know, do they have an anticipated cost per every new student, and what is that for materials, so that if we know we're going to add 200 kids at the virtual school, we also need to know what those non-wage curriculum materials are for those 200 kids, as well as what staffing might be needed in order for us to balance the revenue generated state aid for virtual and what those expenditures tied to that student increase is. So that's really all this slide was summarizing. The last slide that we'll go over today, other than the questions, and you can follow up afterwards with any questions or things that you want addressed further or to talk through further. But this one is important because this is how kind of summarizes the state aid for the last 2 years and tentatively what it is this year till we're audited. And so we have our total resources, and then we have expenditures. If our expenditures in the virtual school, and the target is in the last few years is that they would not spend 100% of what that state aid is generating, is retained in the general fund, and it has helped support some of the general fund expenditures during this time in which we've had our funding go down. And so in 18-19 it was about 385. Last year it was about 400. So thinking it's around that 400,000 mark. This year we knew there was a significant amount of state aid. We anticipated that the costs for virtual would also go up. What we are hoping, and we talked about this at the beginning, was that those costs don't go up to the level in which the 100% of that state aid is needed, and that the increase would be what funds our shortfall this year due to the weighting. So if you remember, I think it was the very first meeting, there is a slide in there that talks really specifically to this, in that the new revenues generated from virtual growth would not be required 100% against their expenditures, to the degree that hopefully of the $1.8 million we're short this year, that at least 800,000 of it we can use as this retained amount back into virtual. That was in the January 13 meeting. We talked through this a little bit, and that is still the case because we are short this year due to the weightings and the drop of over 600 kids this year, that we don't have dollars coming to us this year. So that's part of the puzzle, and why this is important to talk through, and why we really need to understand the impact of virtual going forward, up or down, is that if we still can retain general fund state aid from virtual for general fund, it has a positive impact on how and where we can project for funding. If all of that is used, then it creates or it increases our deficit in a way that we have to come up with more savings, which we just talked about, where some of those places are we have to go for those savings in our elementary buildings. And so it's going to be really, really important that we get a handle on what does virtual school cost, what does growth cost us, all of those, so that it blends and can be navigated in the same puzzle as the district as a whole. And so that's why this is important, and we'll talk about this more. So my question slide, and I'm assuming a lot of you will have the same questions. And these are just ones that I wrote down as I went through. Some of them, so just if there is staffing ratios, what those are, how is that determined? And I think it sounds like there's a system, but we would want to know how that's actually being applied and what that looks like, so we can plan. Is there a best practice for class size in a virtual learning environment at grade levels or across, elementary, middle, and high? I don't know. Is Lawrence different in how they structure our virtual school, and that they would be different than virtual schools across the state? And could that impact cost of instructional materials, so that we can actually plan what that adequate non-wage budget side needs to look like for the virtual school to make sure resources are there. Does data show needs of improvement or areas of the virtual school in which we need to provide some supplemental supports? I know they added a mental health support person a couple years ago. So are there places that the virtual needs support that maybe aren't being addressed? One of the comments in the evaluation was that there could be savings realized if they moved more of their K-12 elementary curriculum to Florida virtual, but there was no dollar amount tied to that. So I'd be interested in what that means and what that looks like, and is there savings? And how does that fit into the big picture of curriculum for virtual school and then brick and mortar? Are we using all our tools within PowerSchool and the WebEx and all the different things that maybe can help create efficiencies? Particularly when we're enrolling families, and what does that look like? And, how do we predict staffing and materials? Can we enroll and support an additional influx of students if that's what happens? And what's needed to do that efficiently? So those were just some thoughts that came to my mind as I navigated how the virtual school fits into our puzzle. I'm sure there are others, and we're out of time, so I'm going to let you mull all this over. And I'm sure, like I said, there was quite a bit of information. We'll kind of pick up and review and refresh. And I think if there are questions, or it would be helpful to have Monty and Candace come in and have some conversation with us as far as just answering your questions, we can certainly invite them and go from there. Anna, do you have any thoughts about that? There's a few other slides we're not
Yeah,
using.
there are a couple of things on here, Kathy, that I can quickly address. The state has already said there's no remote learning. You have to be in a virtual school. So if we have families, they will have to go, because that's been made clear by the state. And the virtual school has started to roll their elementary more to virtual. So we will probably at some point have a number. So that last bullet and those two bullets have actually already started. But the state has already made the determination that after this year, you have to have virtual and brick and mortar separate, more like traditionally what we've done in the past.
Okay. That's helpful. I think that will drive how we need to get some numbers together so we can properly plan for budget impacts and where we can kind of navigate that balance. So it's past time. I won't keep you any longer than I'm sure you all are so excited to go through all this, but it is being recorded. So hopefully you can go back and pick up the recording if it helps to re-go over anything. Please send me your questions. Please send me any scenarios you want us to think about. There are other things to talk through and other sections of the budget that we'll keep talking through. Obviously, you can't just focus on one thing. We want a broad spectrum. But these are some big pieces and potentially, where our dollars are some of these big areas. So we need to navigate some of that early. And when it does come to staffing, it has to be early in order to be able to communicate those changes in a timely fashion and really be able to implement it effectively. So that's all for today. You guys have an awesome evening and stay warm.
Thank you, Kathy.